At around 5 p.m. on the evening of October 27, 2017, a 29-year-old woman named Alexia Duval drove her car down a cul-de-sac in the small, quiet town of Gray, France. She was on her way to her parents' house to celebrate her nephew's second birthday, and it was going to be this big family get-together. Her sister, her brother-in-law, and her little nephew had come in all the way from Paris, which was about a 4-hour drive away. But Alexia realistically had mixed feelings about seeing them all tonight. So Alexia had been going through a pretty hard time recently. She and her husband of 13 years, Jonathan, had been trying to get pregnant, and so she'd done several rounds of fertility treatments, which had thrown her hormones completely out of whack and seemed to affect her a lot more than was typical for most women. And then finally, when all that had led to her actually getting pregnant, she unfortunately had miscarried just a couple of months ago. And so even though Alexia loved her sister's family and got along with them really well, her miscarriage was still really fresh in her mind, and she just knew it was going to be very difficult for her to be around her young nephew. It was just a reminder of what she had lost. Now, Alexia came to a stop outside of a gated driveway at the end of the cul-de-sac, and she rang the intercom. And then when the gate opened up, she drove up the driveway toward a nice house with a very well-kept garden. She parked her car in the driveway behind her father's white van, and then got out of her car. She grabbed a wrapped present out of the back seat, along with a couple of desserts that she'd made, carried them up to the house, and rang the doorbell. And a few seconds later, her mother, Isabelle Fouillot, answered the door with a big smile and led her into the dining room where Alexia's father, Jean-Pierre, sat at the table, talking with Alexia's brother-in-law, Gregory, and also her sister, Stephanie. They all stood up and they greeted her, and then as Alexia began to explain that her husband Jonathan was running late and he'd be here later in a separate car because the job he'd been working that day as an electrician had run long, as she was saying all that, Alexia heard the sound of little feet making their way towards her. A moment later, her 2-year-old nephew, James, ran around the corner and threw his arms around Alexia's legs. And surprisingly, to Alexia's relief, she didn't feel sadness. All she felt was happiness. And so she bent down and scooped him up and gave the boy a big hug, and then she also handed him his birthday present. Eventually, the group settled in for dinner, and for a while, all of Alexia's worries just kind of faded away. She was really close with everybody at the table, especially her mother and her sister Stephanie, and being around them always put her in a good mood. Alexia's husband, Jonathan, finally arrived sometime around 8:30, and he, along with the rest of the group, had a wonderful night, eating and drinking and chatting. After dinner was cleaned up, Alexia's father did go to bed, but everybody else stayed up, and they all just continued having this nice time until around 11 p.m., when Alexia said it was really time for her and Jonathan to head home. They both had early mornings ahead of them. Jonathan had some errands to run in the morning, and Alexia was hoping to get a workout in. A few minutes later, on the drive home, Alexia sat in the passenger seat of Jonathan's car. She'd left her own car at her parents' house because she'd been drinking, and she was planning to pick it up when they came back the next day. Alexia and Jonathan's house was on a quiet residential street, only about a mile away from Alexia's parents' house. And as they made their way down the road, Alexia glanced out the window at a particular house that was just up the street from where they lived. And as she looked at it, she frowned. The neighbor who lived in that house had an adult grandson who had been harassing Alexia all summer. He'd been obsessed with her and would call and text her constantly, to the point where Alexia didn't feel safe even going out for a jog around the block when she was by herself. Now, fortunately, the harassment had stopped a couple of months ago, but only because the man had been committed to a mental hospital. But Alexia didn't really know how long it would be until he got out again, or if he'd already been released. She didn't know, so it just sort of felt like a reprieve, not a long-term solution. But on this night at least, there was nobody peering out at her from the neighbor's window. A minute later, their car pulled into their garage, and Alexia and Jonathan got out. And as Alexia went from the garage into the main house, she passed by a treadmill in the corner of the garage, which had broken down a few weeks ago. She asked Jonathan if he'd gotten around to fixing it yet, and he said no. Alexia just sighed. It was supposed to be a very cold and gloomy morning the next day, and so it looked like she was going to have to run outside. The following morning, around 11 a.m., Jonathan walked up to the door of Alexia's parents' house and rang the doorbell. And as he did, he sort of gave a worried look over his shoulder at Alexia's car, which was still parked where they'd left it the night before. Jonathan took a deep breath and tried not to show how anxious he felt as Alexia's mother, Isabelle, answered the door. And then, in a very shaky voice, Jonathan said hello and asked her if she'd seen or heard from her daughter recently. And when Isabelle said she had not, Jonathan completely lost his composure. He said that morning Alexia had gone out for a jog, but not come back, and now he was starting to get really worried. He explained that he'd tried texting Alexia, but she still hadn't answered, and by this point, she should have been home a long time ago, so something was wrong. A moment later, Jonathan saw Stephanie and Gregory coming out of the guest room with very concerned looks on their faces. They joined Jonathan and Isabel at the front door and asked what the commotion was about. And so Jonathan sort of frantically re-explained the situation and asked if either of them had heard from Alexia in the last hour or so. But they shook their heads and said they hadn't. But Stephanie showed Jonathan that she had received a text from Alexia at 9:30 that morning, just to say that she was going out for this jog. But after that, none of them had received any texts or calls from Alexia. Jonathan was crying at this point, and so Alexia's family tried to assure him that, Alexia would probably just show up at the house any minute here, like nothing's going on, I'm sure she's just running late. And Jonathan, he wanted to believe this, but this was completely unusual. Like, this was not normal for Alexia to be gone for this long without being in touch. It just didn't make sense. It was at this point that Jonathan's brother-in-law, Gregory, reached out and put his hand on Jonathan in a sort of comforting way and just said, look, if it makes you feel any better, I'll go back with you and we can literally go look for Alexia together, or at least be together until she comes back. Jonathan didn't really know what to do, but he was very thankful and said, yep, that would be great. And so a couple of minutes later, the two men got in Gregory's SUV and they began driving back towards their house. But Jonathan actually navigated him through the streets along the running route that Alexia usually took to see if maybe they could find her. They drove down all the side streets looking for her. And then when they reached the edge of town, Jonathan and Gregory got out of the car and began checking the paths leading into the countryside and also the ditches and the banks of the river. But they didn't find Alexia anywhere. And then eventually, they just drove back to Jonathan and Alexia's house to see if maybe she'd finally come home with an explanation for all this, but she had not come home. At this point, Jonathan was completely beside himself, and so Gregory, doing his best to stay calm, said, you know what, let's go to the hospital and see if Alexia had turned up there. A few minutes later, when they stopped in the parking lot of the local hospital, Jonathan jumped out of the car and ran towards the main entrance, where two nurses were taking a cigarette break. Jonathan told these nurses that he was here looking for his wife and that she'd gone on a run 3 hours ago and no one knew where she was now and maybe she's here. So the nurses, who could clearly tell this was an emergency, they put out their cigarettes and went inside to check the register. But a minute later, they came back and told the men that no, Alexia Duvall had not been admitted that morning. She was not here. Before Jonathan or Gregory could protest or ask more questions, the nurses just said, look, you gotta go to the police. Later that afternoon, a police officer named Adeline P.O. sat across from Jonathan in a room at the Gray police station as he explained what had happened with his wife, that she was missing. Jonathan also gave a description of what Alexia had been wearing when she went out running. Bright pink shoes, black leggings, and a red jacket, so pretty easy to spot. And then after describing her and sort of realizing the weight of what he was here for, he just put his head in his hands and continued to weep, as he had been doing much of the morning. Now, P.O. could obviously tell that Jonathan was very upset here, but she had to ask the question that was already forming in her mind. So, as delicately as possible, she asked Jonathan if his wife had any suicidal tendencies, or any reason she might have run off without telling anybody. Jonathan looked up really quickly and just shook his head and said no, and said that overall his wife was very happy, and definitely not suicidal. However, as he sat there thinking about it, he said she had been taking hormones for fertility, and realistically, those hormones appeared to have affected her really badly. For example, sometimes she would lose control of her emotions entirely and even become violent. Or in other instances, he said that she would even have memory lapses, where she wouldn't even know what she was doing when she was doing it. It was like she had become this different person. P.O. nodded and just listened to Jonathan and wrote down everything he was saying. And then when he was done, she followed up and said, can you think of anybody who might have had a problem with Alexia? And for a moment, Jonathan just sat there in silence, kind of mulling over the question. And then suddenly his eyes went wide, like he had just realized something. He told P.O. that they had a neighbor who had been completely obsessed with Alexia earlier that year. He said his name was Arnaud, and he'd been obsessively calling and texting her so many times that Alexia had actually had to block his number, and had actually talked about how she was fearful of going out alone because of this neighbor. But just a couple of months earlier, he had been sent to a psychiatric hospital, and because he was literally removed from the neighborhood, the harassment had stopped. But Jonathan said they were kind of worried that at some point he would come back and then he would be a problem again. And realistically, Jonathan said he could be home now. I just don't know. I don't know where he is. Pio was obviously very intrigued by this, and so after this interview was over with Jonathan, she and her investigative team began digging into this Arnaud guy to see where he was and what was going on with him. And pretty quickly, they discovered that while Arnaud had gone to that psychiatric hospital, that was true, he was not there anymore. He had been released. And so that night, another officer with the Gray Police knocked on the door of Arnaud's mother's house, where Arnaud was staying, which was about an hour away from Alexia and Jonathan's house. After the officer knocked, a middle-aged woman answered the door. And when the officer asked if she was Arnaud's mother, she said she was. The officer looked past her, and he could see there was this disheveled-looking young man sitting right inside. And he asked the mother if that was Arnaud. And again, the woman said yes. At this point, the officer asked the mother if he could come inside, because he said he needed to speak privately with her son. The mother and Arnaud in the background both seemed very confused by this, but after a minute, they both agreed, and the officer came inside. And so the officer went inside the house and sat down in the living room with Arnaud, while Arnaud's mother went to the kitchen to give the men some privacy. And then once the mother was gone, the officer looked at Arnaud and just said he had some questions about Alexia Duvall. Arnaud immediately looked down at this question, like he was embarrassed and couldn't even look at the officer. But then he looked back up again and told the officer that he had bipolar disorder, and sometimes when he was in a manic state, he acted inappropriately towards women, including Alexia. The officer followed up about all those messages that apparently Arnaud had sent to Alexia that summer, like what was going on with that. And Arnaud admitted that he had done that, but he insisted it really was no big deal. He said that he and Alexia knew each other because they had been neighbors at one point, and they'd also hung out in a group setting once, and so him being in touch with her was not totally weird, like they had a real connection. But Arnaud clarified that when Alexia told him to stop contacting her, he did. And that was the end of it. But this caught the officer's attention, because according to Alexia's husband, Jonathan, the only reason that all the calls and texts had stopped was because Alexia literally had to block Arnaud's phone number. So the officer just cut to the chase here and told Arnaud that Alexia was missing. And then before Arnaud could say anything, the officer asked him where he'd been that morning at 9 a.m. And Arnaud said, I was right here. I was at home with my mom. For a moment, the officer just stared at Arnaud, trying to read his body language to see if maybe he was being deceptive or not. So eventually, the officer just stood up and went into the kitchen where the mother was. And he asked the mother, "Where was your son this morning?" And she told the officer with sort of a bewildered look on her face that he was here with me all morning. And so at this point, it was clear to the officer that, if the mother was telling the truth here, it would officially rule out Arnaud as a suspect because, he was here. But the officer also knew that, generally speaking, mothers do not make the best alibis, because mothers are known to lie, cheat, steal, and do anything to protect their kids. The following afternoon, on Sunday, October 29th, Chief Officer Frank Paredes glanced out his office window as yet another news van sped past outside down the usually quiet streets of Gray. By now, Alexia's disappearance had blown up into this huge national news story, and this was making it really difficult for Paredes, who was in charge of the investigation. Now, it was still early in the investigation, but already he and his investigators were being hounded by reporters and camera crews at every step. Paredes closed his eyes and tried to focus on what his next step should be. The search effort was well underway. They had called in reinforcements from nearby towns and even organized search teams with volunteers from the public. At that very moment, law enforcement was also using drones and dogs to scour the town and the surrounding woods. Paredes' investigation team had also searched Jonathan and Alexia's home by now, secretly hoping they might find something to pin the disappearance on Jonathan. But there was no blood, no sign of a struggle, and no clues that gave them any direction there. And also, all of Alexia's other family members, her parents, her sister Stephanie, and her brother-in-law Gregory, they could all vouch for each other's whereabouts on the morning of Alexia's disappearance. They claimed they had all been at the house together. And so without any real leads, Paredes had gotten so desperate for any information that he'd literally told his team to set up checkpoints out in the streets and just stop random people and ask them if they had seen or heard anything that could help them find Alexia. And now, as Paredes sat in his office wondering what he was going to do today, he heard a knock at his door. And a moment later, one of his investigators entered with fairly surprising news. The checkpoints actually had turned up something. Paredes listened intently as the investigator explained that a number of people he'd spoken to had mentioned a van. Now, no one had actually seen the van themselves, but they all appeared to have heard the same rumor, that apparently there was a man driving around the area in this white van, and he was known to harass girls and women right out on the street. Now, at first glance, Paredes was worried that perhaps this was just like an unfounded rumor, but then he remembered there were actually two men in Alexia's family who literally drove white vans. Her father, Jean-Pierre, he owned one, and her husband, Jonathan, he drove one for work. On the afternoon of Monday, October 30th, so a little more than 2 days after Alexia went missing, Paredes brought his car to a stop next to a news van parked in the middle of the woods about 4 miles outside of town. Minutes ago, he had received a call from an officer in the field telling him that Alexia's body had been found. And so Paredes had driven out to the scene as fast as he could. But now that Paredes was here at the crime scene, he could tell obviously he was late to the game because, a news crew was already here, setting up their cameras near a row of police barriers. And Paredes was disappointed to see this because he'd hoped that if and when her body was discovered, if she was found dead, at that time he would have had at least one suspect or hopefully multiple suspects identified and under surveillance before the word got out to the general public that Alexia was found dead. But now he obviously would not get that chance. Paredes sighed, climbed out of his car, and flashed his badge to an officer who led him around the barriers and into the crime scene. Paredes approached one of the forensics experts who was taking photos and placing yellow numbered markers around on the ground, and Paredes introduced himself as the lead investigator. The expert then led him over to Alexia's body, which was lying on the ground between two tree trunks covered by a white bedsheet. Her pink running shoes were poking out from under the sheet, and Paredes noticed that her feet and the sheet were both partially burned, as if someone had tried to set them on fire at some point. Once the scene had been fully photographed, Paredes bent down and lifted the sheet to get a better look at Alexia's body. She was lying on her back, and there were bruises all over her face, and there were also marks on her neck that looked like they were from strangulation. And right away, Paredes noticed a couple of things that were unusual. First, Alexia's hands were placed neatly in the pockets of her coat, as though her body had been placed there on the ground with a lot of care. Second, despite the beating that Alexia's face had apparently taken, her glasses were placed perfectly on her face. And so to Paredes, it seemed like whoever killed Alexia had felt some sort of remorse afterwards. It was as though the killer had committed this incredibly violent murder, but then had tried to kind of put everything back in order afterward. And this made Paredes think that Alexia's killer was very likely someone who knew Alexia, and not a stranger who simply, accosted her during a jog. Just then, Paredes heard somebody call his name, and he stood up to take a look. Nearby, there was a forensics tech that was waving him over. And so Paredes walked over, and the tech showed Paredes what he had just found. It was a gray plastic cap that looked like it belonged on some kind of spray can. Paredes thought, maybe this could help explain the strange burn marks on the bedsheet and also Alexia's shoes. The killer had probably sprayed something on the body to try and help it catch fire, but it didn't work as well as they thought it would. Just then, another forensics tech called Paredes over to them to show him something else they had found: tire tracks in the dirt. Paredes immediately thought about that tip that he had been given about this van with this person driving around town harassing women and girls, and he wondered if maybe that was true, that this van was involved and that these had been left by the killer when they were transporting Alexia's body. And so as this forensics expert began taking photographs of the tire tracks, Paredes made a mental note to examine the tires of every suspect, family member, and other persons of interest they came across, just in case one of them was a match. And so Paredes was about to turn his attention back to the body when he noticed one more unusual thing out in the woods. There was this young man who did not appear to be a reporter, just kind of wandering around out there in the trees, almost lurking near the crime scene. And so immediately Paredes went over to this guy and demanded to know what he was doing here. And at this, the man went completely wide-eyed and just started stuttering like he was totally caught off guard. Eventually, the guy managed to mumble that he was just out here picking mushrooms, but Paredes could tell he was obviously lying. That was not why he was out here. And so, operating on sort of a gut instinct, Paredes pulled out his handcuffs and placed the man under arrest. Later that same afternoon, just hours after Alexia's body had been discovered in the woods outside of town, Paredes sat down at a table at the Gray police station across from this suspicious young man he just arrested for lurking near the crime scene for no clear reason. And Paredes was pleased. I mean, he'd only been in charge of what was now a murder investigation for a couple of hours, and here he was about to speak to a legitimate suspect, really like the first suspect, who was in custody. But as soon as Paredes actually began speaking to this suspect, he realized that the young man's stutter was not really a sign of him being nervous. He actually had speech issues, and he struggled to speak at all, even when he wasn't nervous. The man was eventually able to explain that his name was Anthony and he was 29 years old. He said he lived with his parents in Apremont, another small town about 5 miles away, and he admitted that he had lied about being there to pick mushrooms. And so Paredes pressed Anthony to explain then why he was there. And Anthony, he seemed a little embarrassed as he began to explain, but what he said was he didn't know Alexia personally. He had just heard about her disappearance in the news, and he wanted to help with the search effort. But Anthony said he couldn't read or write, so he had not been able to fill out the paperwork to join the official search party. So instead, he'd just driven out to the woods in his own car to look for Alexia himself. But while he was out there, the police showed up, and clearly there was something going on, and when Paredes walked over to him, Anthony said he got scared and just lied and said, "Oh, I'm out here picking mushrooms." Like he said it was just embarrassment. And as Paredes sat there listening to the story, he wasn't quite sure what to make of it, or really what to make of Anthony. Anthony's demeanor seemed almost childlike, but his behavior was not childlike. It was very adult-like and pretty suspicious. So Paredes followed up by asking him what he was doing on the morning of October 28th, which was the morning Alexia went missing. Anthony said he'd woken up at his parents' house and had breakfast with them before he went out with his girlfriend and also another friend. And he gave Paredes their names and also their phone numbers so they could confirm it. So Paredes stepped out of the room, and he did exactly that. He called the various phone numbers and spoke to the people in Anthony's life, and they all corroborated his alibi. So despite how suspicious Anthony had been acting, Paredes had no choice but to let Anthony go. A week later, on November 5th, a march was organized in Alexia's honor. 10,000 people turned out to show their support for Alexia's family and also to protest violence against women. And hidden among this huge crowd was a pair of police officers who'd been assigned to follow Alexia's husband, Jonathan Duvall. At this point, Jonathan really was looking like the most obvious suspect, since he was the husband and also the last person to see Alexia alive. So the police had tapped his phone and put him under surveillance. But all they had learned so far from the phone taps was that Jonathan made frequent calls to Alexia's family, to his own siblings and his friends, to talk about how much he missed his wife. And the officers who were literally following Jonathan around found that he really rarely left his house except to visit Alexia's parents, which he did almost every day. But so far, it was like none of Jonathan's behavior actually seemed really suspicious at all. And now, at this big march, the investigators stood in the crowd and watched as Jonathan hobbled his way up the steps to the podium, followed by Alexia's mother and father. And in fact, Jonathan was trembling so much by the time he got up there that Alexia's parents had to physically prop him up before he could begin reading his speech to the crowd. And so at this point, the investigators just kind of exchanged a glance. Either they were wasting their time following an obviously grieving husband with nothing to hide, or Jonathan was like a world-class actor giving the performance of a lifetime. But the investigators knew that until new evidence presented itself, there was really nothing they could do but, watch and wait, which included watching Jonathan and just seeing what he did. They were also still waiting on the tire analysis from the crime scene, but they didn't expect much to come from it. At this point, the creepy white van story seemed to be more like an urban legend in this town. And so, as the weeks turned to months and still there was no progress on this case, the investigators, including Paredes, began to wonder if this case would ever be solved. But then, all of a sudden, new evidence did appear. And when it did, the investigators realized they might have been following the wrong lead this whole time. because while they'd been focused on surveilling Jonathan, a second body had just turned up in the woods outside of Gray. On the evening of Saturday, January 6, 2018, Chief Officer Paredes was at his desk, poring over the evidence that had been flooding in all day. The new victim, whose body had been found earlier that same day in the woods, very close to where Alexia's body had been found, was a 38-year-old father of 3. He looked to have died from a gunshot wound to the head, although, according to the autopsy report, the man had a blood alcohol level of almost 0.4%, which is huge. I mean, that can be fatal on its own, or at the very least, knock somebody unconscious. Investigators had found gunpowder on the man's hand, so for now, they were treating his death as a suicide. But the more Paredes looked into the evidence, the less convinced he became that he was looking at a suicide. Because, a gun had been found at the scene, but it had not been located very close to the dead man's body. In fact, the gun was found 130 feet away from the body in a trash can. The only explanation would be he shot himself and then put the gun in the trash can and then somehow wandered 130 feet away before collapsing and dying. That was possible, albeit highly unlikely. Being shot in the head typically is immediately incapacitating or lethal, but it is possible he could have shot himself and lived long enough to travel the 130 feet. It just seemed very unlikely. So now Paredes sat back in his chair and just tried to think. It was strange enough to have 2 violent deaths in this same quiet town, let alone to have the bodies be found basically in the exact same spot in the surrounding woods. It just seemed too coincidental not to be looked into. So he had to wonder, maybe there was a connection between this man's death and Alexia's. But later that same month, as Paredes scanned over a document that had just arrived from the crime lab, he wasn't thinking about that second body in the woods anymore. Because this new document in his hands was an expert analysis of those tire tracks that had been found in the woods near Alexia's body. And the analysis showed that there was a tiny defect in the tread of one of the tires. And this defect was so specific that the experts had been able to determine exactly which vehicle left those tracks in the woods. And this vehicle just so happened to be a white van. Paredes felt his pulse quicken as he kept on reading, and a moment later, he reached for his phone and he called his supervisor to tell him the good news. He knew the identity of Alexia's killer. Based on that tire track analysis and also other evidence, including an eventual confession from the killer, this is how police believe Alexia Duvall was killed. The killer was almost blind with rage. They slammed Alexia's head against a nearby wall and then hit her over and over again. And then they wrapped their hands around her neck and they squeezed for so long they lost track of time. They were just crushing her neck. And then finally, they couldn't feel her pulse under their fingers anymore. Then, looking down at Alexia's motionless body on the ground, they realized the severity of what they had just done. And so the killer, in a panic, crouched down next to her and actually tried to wake her up. But it was too late, she was dead. And so now they're really panicking. They thought about maybe killing themselves out of guilt, but they were too scared to go through with it. So instead, they hatched a plan to get rid of Alexia's body. The killer very carefully put Alexia's glasses back on her face, and then they lifted her up and they carried her body out to their vehicle. Then they drove out to the woods and dragged her body by the feet to a secluded spot deep in the trees where they hoped nobody would ever find her. They covered Alexia's body in a sheet, and then they sprayed the sheet with this foam that they thought was flammable, hoping that once they lit it on fire, it would help, dispose of the body. But when they got their lighter out and held the flame to the sheet, it didn't really work. And so finally, when it was clear they were not going to be able to burn the body here, the killer just left her there and then drove away in their white van, getting home in time to dispose of all the evidence, take a shower, and start the next phase of the cover-up, which was to knock on Alexia's mother's door in a fake panic, asking if anybody had seen her daughter. Because Alexia's killer was her own husband, Jonathan. It turns out Alexia never even went for a run on the morning of October 28th. She was murdered the night before, after she and Jonathan had gotten back from her parents' house. They had gotten into a big fight, which obviously resulted in her death. From the outside, Jonathan and Alexia appeared to be a very happy couple, but in reality, they'd been arguing more and more often, primarily because they were not able to have a baby. It was causing a lot of friction in their marriage. And so on the night of October 27th, in the middle of this horrible fight they're having, Jonathan grabbed his keys and tried to leave, but Alexia told him to stop running away from their problems and tried to literally take the keys from him. And according to Jonathan, that's when he just snapped and he killed her. And then he used his work van to dispose of the body. As for that second body that was found in the woods months later, that was determined to be a suicide and completely unrelated to Alexia's death. Jonathan was arrested on January 28, 2018, and 2 days after his arrest, he confessed to the murder. At the end of his trial in 2020, he was convicted and sentenced to 25 years in prison. On December 10, 2006, a slight man in his 20s with thick black hair stood shivering as he worked on the slaughterhouse floor at Quality Pork Processors in Austin, Minnesota. Machinery clanked in the background, and the metallic smell of fresh blood and acrid bleach hung in the air. The man, whose name was Javier, felt the freezing wind blow in from the loading docks and seep through the thin white lab coat he wore over his clothes. But Javier wasn't just cold. His muscles ached, he felt like he might have a fever, and his hands and feet tingled as if they were asleep. He hoped he wasn't coming down with the flu. He stomped his feet and tried to shake the tingling sensation out of his hands, but that didn't help. Javier's workstation was the last stop on a conveyor line that snaked its way through a large room. On this line, workers systematically carved up each hog carcass into roughly 150 pounds of pork, sausage, bacon, and other cuts of meat. Javier stood shoulder to shoulder at a long table with two other workers. A young woman named Maria was to his right, and on his left was an older man named Carlos. And the three of them, their job was to process the pigs' heads. All three of them wore rubber boots and safety glasses, and their lab coats were pretty much always stained with blood and gore. Maria and Carlos looked up as Javier kept stomping his feet, but they quickly forgot about him and returned their attention to the work in front of them. A new pig head came down the line about every 3 seconds, and there really wasn't time to make conversation. Javier had started this job 3 months earlier after moving all the way from Oaxaca, Mexico. Someone he knew from his hometown had moved here to Austin, Minnesota first, and then sent word back home to Mexico saying there were lots of good jobs here, and so the town of Austin, Minnesota had now filled up with friends and relatives from the same area in Mexico. Javier and his wife, Anna, had decided to take a risk and follow all these people going to Minnesota. They'd packed up their entire lives and brought their 2 young kids. The freezing winter was a huge adjustment, and it was hard to be in a place where they didn't speak the same language, but Javier was learning English as quickly as he could, and for now he was lucky that most of his coworkers were Latino as well, so he could speak Spanish at work. And so Javier and Anna were quickly becoming part of a tight-knit Mexican community in Minnesota. Javier, who loved basketball, had even found a few friends to play pickup games with on the weekends when it was warm enough outside. And so all in all, Javier was happy with his new life in Minnesota. He was glad to have his job at the meatpacking plant, even though it was totally physically punishing. Everyone on the processing line did the same thing over and over and over again all day long. Javier knew that many of his coworkers suffered from repetitive motion injuries, such as carpal tunnel syndrome, which causes numbness, tingling, and pain in the hand and forearm. But on that cold December day, Javier tried not to focus on his aching, tingling limbs. There was a nurse on duty at the plant, but he didn't want to risk being sent home. He didn't have many sick days left, and he really needed the paycheck. His family needed winter clothes, and their expenses were much higher in Austin, Minnesota than they had been back in Mexico. So despite how horrible he felt, Javier remained in his place between Maria and Carlos at the end of the processing line. He turned his attention to the work in front of him and finished his shift before heading home. The next day, Javier woke up in his apartment, shivering under his blanket. Before he even opened his eyes, he realized that he still felt achy and his hands were still very tingly. And it was an odd sensation in his hands, almost like his hands belonged to someone else. As Javier pulled the blanket closer to his body, he immediately felt that same feverish chill that he'd had the previous day at the plant. Javier desperately just wanted to go back to sleep, but he knew he couldn't. He had to go to work. Javier finally opened his eyes and tried to swing his legs towards the edge of the bed, but nothing happened. His legs remained still. He tried to tense the muscles, but felt no response. With his heart racing, he sat up and grabbed at his thighs with his hands, and to Javier's horror, they just felt like dead weight. No matter what he did, he couldn't get his legs to move. Javier frantically yelled out that he couldn't feel his legs. His wife, Anna, rushed inside with a look of deep concern on her face. Cold sweat started dripping from Javier's brow as the realization of his situation sunk in. He told Anna that he needed to go to the hospital right now. The couple didn't have a car, so Anna called a taxi, and then she and their kids literally carried Javier from his bed to the cab. Javier did his best to keep a brave face on for his family, but when he looked over at his wife, he could tell how scared she was. When Javier and Anna arrived at the Austin Medical Center, which was just a few miles from their apartment, medical technicians lifted Javier onto a gurney and wheeled him into an exam room. A few minutes later, a doctor entered the room, followed by an interpreter who greeted Javier in Spanish and said her name was Carol. For the next few minutes, the doctor and Javier discussed his symptoms as Carol translated their statements. Finally, the doctor said something to Carol, and then the doctor left the room. Javier could hear him making a phone call from his office across the hallway. Carol leaned into Javier and explained that the doctor suspected that Javier had nerve damage, but he didn't know what had caused it, and the Austin Medical Center was not really equipped to treat it. The doctor had recommended that Javier be transferred to the Mayo Clinic, a larger medical center about 50 miles away in Rochester, Minnesota. He was making those arrangements now. Javier looked over at Anna as she squeezed his hand. He didn't want to go so far away from her and the kids, but he needed to get better so he could go back to work. Javier looked back at Carol and nodded. He would go to the Mayo Clinic. Two weeks later, Javier lay in a hospital bed at the Mayo Clinic, looking out the window at the falling snow. It was Christmas Day, and Javier wished he could be home celebrating with his family. He had spent the past 2 weeks having countless blood tests, being rolled in and out of MRI machines, and feeling needle pokes at his veins. But he didn't feel much better, and he still couldn't move his legs. The doctors explained that his spinal cord was severely inflamed, which was causing his symptoms. However, the doctor said that they still had no idea why, except that it had to do with Javier's own immune system. For some reason, it was attacking his own nerves instead of helping to keep him healthy. A nurse walked into the room and checked Javier's IV drip. Javier was being treated with steroids, which are powerful chemicals that reduce swelling in the human body. His doctors had promised Javier that steroids would bring some relief to his spinal cord, although they probably would not completely cure his mysterious ailment. Javier winced as he remembered the doctor who told him that he might spend the rest of his life in a wheelchair. The thought of that filled Javier with dread. If he couldn't walk, then he would not be able to keep working at the meat processing plant. He would have no way to make a living for Anna and the kids, and he would become dead weight to his whole family. Javier thought that he and Anna had come too far and worked too hard to give up now. And so he looked down at his tingling legs, and with all his might, he tried to move them, and just then he saw he could wiggle his toes. Just a little. Wasn't much, but it was a start. Javier decided he would do everything he could to try to get back on his feet. As Javier was struggling to recover, Carol Hidalgo, the translator at the Austin Medical Center, walked into a small exam room with a doctor to help out a new patient. It was early in the spring of 2007, about 4 months after Javier had first been hospitalized, and Carol was always extremely busy. This area had a lot of Spanish-speaking residents, so she was constantly translating for the hospital's medical staff. It was tiring work, but Carol enjoyed it. She felt like she was a problem solver. The latest patient was a tired-looking man in his 40s who worked at the quality pork processors plant with Javier. The man, whose name was Carlos, the man who stood next to Javier on the processing line, rubbed his legs as he explained that he'd been feeling weak and experiencing tingling in his limbs for over a month now. Carol listened carefully and relayed his symptoms to the doctor. Carlos said that his right hip and thigh were throbbing, and it was as if the soles of his feet were on fire. At first, he thought he was just tired from standing all day long, but now he was having trouble walking. Carlos said that he barely had the energy to do his job, but he desperately needed the money. His family's trailer home had burned down in the winter, and he was putting in extra hours to try to afford the rent on their new home. Carol's heart broke for him. She saw a lot of patients like Carlos. They worked so hard in order to make a better life for their families, but it was often at their body's expense. Their bodies often broke down as a result of the grueling work. She translated his story for the doctor, who nodded and told Carol to let Carlos know she was going to examine his legs. And when she was done, she shook her head and said that she'd need to run more tests. Carlos's muscles seemed fine, and so the doctor suspected that his problems were actually a nerve issue. As the doctor was speaking, Carol frowned. Something about this sounded familiar, but she couldn't exactly place what it was. And anyways, she saw so many patients every single day that it really wasn't that surprising that people's symptoms kind of bleeded together and sounded similar. So Carol jotted down some notes, and then she shook Carlos's hand and told him she hoped that he would feel better soon. Carol followed the doctor out of the room. Austin Medical Center was very crowded that day, and Carol had another patient that she needed to help. In May of 2007, so about 5 months after Javier first got sick, Javier proudly walked back through the Quality Pork Processor's plant doors with a huge smile on his face. For months, his family had survived on their tiny savings and the charity of friends and neighbors. His doctors still didn't know what had made him sick, but the steroid treatments had reduced the inflammation in his spinal cord, and with intense and very painful physical therapy, Javier had slowly learned to walk again, even though he did still need a cane for balance. But his doctors thought he was well enough to work again, and the plant had cleared him to come back. Javier yelled greetings to his co-workers, Maria and Carlos, over the very noisy machinery, and right away Javier noticed that they both looked very tired and were moving so stiffly. But there really wasn't time to talk. It was time to get back to work. Javier was the happiest he'd been since that horrible day in December when he first got sick. But despite the progress he had made, Javier still was not fully healed. While he had regained control of his legs, he had not regained control of his bladder. So he had to wear a catheter, a tube that collected his urine in a bag. The bag was taped to his leg under his pants, so it wouldn't be noticeable to anyone. Javier took a deep breath, stepped up to his old place in the assembly line, and got back to work. 3 weeks later, Javier sat on a bench outside the factory during his lunch break, resting in the sun. Since he had come back to work, the pain in his legs had returned. He knew his body wasn't as strong as it used to be, and he hoped it was just part of the healing process. As Javier tried to relax, Maria, the woman who worked with him on the processing line, walked over and eased down next to him. She groaned and rubbed her legs. She told Javier she had a knot in her calf that just wouldn't go away, and her arms were feeling so heavy. Maria's eyes filled with tears as she told Javier that her arms were so sore she could barely hold up the spoon to feed her baby daughter when she was at home. She said their colleague, Carlos, was struggling too, but he was trying to work through the pain. Suddenly, a whistle blew, which meant the lunch break was over. Javier watched as Maria slowly stood up and stretched, and then Javier tried to get up too, but suddenly his legs gave out from under him. He tried to stand up again, but his legs just wouldn't move. Javier told Maria to please go get help. He needed a doctor immediately. 3 months later, in September of 2007, Carol, the translator at Austin Medical Center, was in the emergency room helping a young woman named Maria, the same Maria who worked next to Javier at the QPP processing plant. Carol couldn't believe that Maria was sitting in a wheelchair. Just a few months earlier, she'd seen the young mother for another exam, and she seemed fine. Now, Maria could hardly stand up and needed help to get on the exam table, and when she tried to sign an authorization form, she couldn't even hold the pen. Maria said that it felt like her right arm had fallen asleep, and her feet were completely numb and tingling. A doctor came into the room and performed an examination. He tested Maria's reflexes and then arranged for additional blood tests. Then he had Carol tell Maria that he did have a diagnosis. Maria had a condition called neuropathy, which is a general term for nerve damage. It explained her weakness, numbness, and pain. He didn't know what was causing it, but he was still prescribing her steroids. After the doctor left, Carol, the translator, could see that Maria seemed unsure what to do. In a quiet voice, Maria told Carol that she was scared. A lot of her colleagues were getting sick too. One of them had even lost movement of his legs twice. Carol gave her a hug and promised her that the doctors would find an answer. Then she helped Maria back into her wheelchair and wheeled her to the elevator. After Maria left, Carol returned to the treatment area, deep in thought. Carol liked to write while she puzzled things out in her head. She sat in a chair and took out her notebook and a pen, and she watched people rush by in the hallway. She realized that she had translated for several patients over the past few months who all had very similar symptoms. There was Maria, who just a few months ago was walking but now could barely move, and then there was Carlos, whose feet felt like they were burning, and then there was Javier, whose legs had stopped working altogether. She scribbled down the first thing that they had in common. They had all been diagnosed with a type of neuropathy, and so Carol wondered if maybe something else connected these patients. Carol knew that each of these patients had different doctors and nurses, and these doctors and nurses rarely talked about their patients to each other. As a translator, Carol might be the only person in the clinic who knew that these patients had been diagnosed with the same problems. Just then, Carol spotted the chair of general medicine, Dr. Richard Schindler, walk by in the hallway. Carol knew he valued the opinions of everyone on his staff. He always found the time to talk. Carol ran after him and asked if he had a moment to chat. He nodded and said that he did. Then Carol took a breath and she asked him, "What causes neuropathy?" Carol had heard the diagnosis before, but she'd never quite understood it. He smiled at her and said that one of the most common causes of neuropathy was diabetes. Carol shook her head. She knew that Javier didn't have diabetes, and neither did Carlos or Maria. Dr. Schindler then told her that neuropathy can also result from traumatic injuries, exposure to toxins, and from infections. Dr. Schindler asked Carol why she was interested, and she told him that she'd translated for at least 3 patients who were all diagnosed with neuropathy. Carol was almost certain they all worked at the same pork processing plant. She thought there might be more she had forgotten about, but she needed his help to get a better understanding of their diagnosis. Dr. Schindler's expression grew thoughtful, and he told Carol to please find him later and he would help her try to figure it out. And so, later that afternoon, Carol and Dr. Schindler sat down together and went over the files of every patient that had been diagnosed with neuropathy in the past year. Carol could see Dr. Schindler's face grow anxious as they sifted through the names and charts. By the end of the day, he and Carol had identified 6 different cases of neuropathy that all seemed to be linked. Not only did they all work at quality pork processors, but they all worked in the same area of the processing line. Dr. Schindler thanked Carol for paying such close attention to the patients, and Carol told him that all she wanted was to figure out what was making them sick. She saw firsthand how much their jobs meant to them and their families. Carol just hoped that there was still time to help them before they became permanently paralyzed or worse. The next morning, after going through the patient files, Dr. Schindler picked up the phone to call the pork processing plant. He reached the factory's nurse and introduced himself and then explained the situation. He said several workers from her plant who were suffering from neuropathy had come to his clinic to be treated, and so now he needed to know if maybe other people who worked at this plant had maybe come to her with the same symptoms. He could hear the nurse pause for a moment, and then she said that she did remember some workers coming to her with tingling and soreness in their limbs, and she gave Dr. Schindler their names. He added them to the list of patients that he and Carol had already identified, making a total of more than 11 workers from this plant who all had similar symptoms. Dr. Schindler thanked the nurse for her help, and then they hung up. Clearly, there was something wrong at this pork processing plant, but the doctor didn't know what it was. He wondered if maybe workers were reacting to a vaccination, or maybe they had an infectious illness, or they'd been exposed to neurotoxic chemicals. He didn't know, but there was something there. Something was going on at this plant. Dr. Schindler realized that this could quickly turn into a huge medical investigation, one beyond the scope of just a small regional facility like the Austin, Minnesota Medical Center. And so the doctor sent out an email to Mayo Clinic, a much bigger clinic, which was where Javier had been treated. It was one of the best medical facilities in the state, and if anyone could help with this investigation that was about to start, it was them. Doctors at the Mayo Clinic quickly brought all 11 affected workers into their clinic one by one to test them for a long list of diseases and disorders. But all of the tests proved to be negative. Dr. Schindler reviewed the results with a growing sense of frustration. Within just a few months, these once healthy workers now had to use wheelchairs or had lost sensation in their arms, legs, or hands. It couldn't be a simple muscular disorder like carpal tunnel syndrome or any other repetitive stress injury. It wasn't a reaction to a vaccination, cancer, or a virus. It also was not a bacteria or a parasite. There had to be something happening at the pork processing plant, but no one at the Austin, Minnesota Medical Center or the Mayo Clinic could figure it out. Dr. Schindler realized that if he was going to get to the bottom of why people who worked at this plant were getting so sick, he would need more help. It was time to call the Minnesota Department of Health. On November 28, 2007, around 2 months after Carol, the interpreter, realized that something at the plant was making all these people sick, Dr. Ruth Linfield, the Minnesota State epidemiologist, pulled her car into Quality Pork Processing's parking lot. At the same time, several other cars drove into the lot and parked right next to her. Dr. Linfield was there to lead an inspection of the meat processing line. She'd brought with her a delegation of 3 animal health experts, a medical detective, an infection control specialist, and a toxicologist. Whatever was causing the workers at this plant to get sick, Dr. Linfield and her team were confident they would figure out what it was. The company's CEO, a man named Kelly Wadding, along with the head of HR and the company nurse, stepped forward to greet their visitors and lead them into the factory. Dr. Linfield stepped into the entry with the rest of the team, and she pulled protective gear over her dark gray business suit. Plastic gloves, booties, masks, and plastic gowns. Then she followed the CEO, Kelly Wadding, out onto the factory floor, and the inspection began. First, the investigators were escorted through the entry room, where enormous pigs weighing about 250 pounds were stunned and then slaughtered. After the pigs were slaughtered, their blood was drained and their carcasses were thoroughly cleaned. From the entry room, the group moved into the section called the warm room, where the carcasses were hung by their rear legs and butchered into different parts. As the investigators followed the path of the pig carcasses around the warm room, Dr. Linfield and her team observed the tasks being performed at each workstation. Each worker made a particular cut in the hog carcass. Some used machinery, and others used large knives. It was messy and repetitive, but so far, Dr. Linfield hadn't seen anything that could cause an outbreak of disease. Finally, at a section near the end of the line, the group came to a large table. About 35 workers were gathered there, removing the last bit of meat from the hog using a specialized device. A pink mist hung over the table. Dr. Linfield stopped walking and looked down at her plastic white gown. She could see all these tiny pink particles settling on her arms, chest, and shoulders. Then she looked back at the assembly line and was horrified by what she was seeing. And within minutes, the company's CEO, Kelly Wadding, had shut the entire plant down. Dr. Linfield was looking at what quality pork processors called the head table, where workers literally took apart the pig's head piece by piece. They cut out the snout, the ears, tongues, cheeks, and jaws of each hog using knives, chisels, and automatic cutting tools. But the part of the process that horrified Dr. Linfield was the very last step, when workers removed the pig's brain. Like the rest of the pig's body, its brain is a marketable product. People in some parts of the world will use pig brain to thicken their stir-fry, while other people scramble pig brain in with eggs. But because the plant processed the pigs so rapidly, the plant needed an efficient, easy way to extract the brains from the pig's skulls. They came up with a unique method to get the brain out, which only a few other factories in the world had even tried. Under the company's unusual process, the brain removal workers were required to blast pressurized air into a hole in the pig's skull. And then the brain poured out of that same hole the air went in, now a gooey pink substance that kind of resembled Pepto-Bismol or a lumpy strawberry milkshake. And workers were blasting pig brains at an incredible speed, liquefying about 22 brains every minute. It was a gruesome process, to be sure, but what caught Dr. Linfield's attention was something else. It was the pink mist that hovered around the whole head table and then lightly coated the rest of the room thanks to the air currents from the fan above them. That pink mist was created by tiny particles of pig brain. The air gun that workers used to liquefy the brain was so strong that some of the brain became vaporized and basically floated up into the air. None of the workers wore any kind of breathing protection, such as respirators or face masks, so everyone in the room, but especially those who worked at the head table, and even more so the actual brain removal workers, were inhaling particles from 1,350 aerosolized pig brains every hour. Javier was a brain removal worker, and Carlos and Maria worked very close to his station. In fact, almost all the workers who got sick were stationed right near the brain removal machine. Dr. Linfield's team discovered that all of these workers were suffering from a brand new disease, which was given the name progressive inflammatory neuropathy. As a result of their massive exposure to aerosolized pig brain matter, their immune systems were constantly creating antibodies to neutralize the foreign proteins. But because these animal cells were very similar to human cells, the antibodies ended up attacking their own nerve cells as well, and over time, the disease could do enough damage to leave victims confined to a wheelchair. Kelly Wadding, the pork processing CEO, shut off the air gun as soon as Dr. Linfield pointed out all the pig brain particles floating in the air all around his employees. And then the CEO had that air gun hauled out of the factory on a trolley, never to return. And once that air gun was gone and the factory resumed work, the workers at the head table stopped getting sick. Javier would return to work a second time, but his body was so damaged that he could not actually handle the physical demands of the job. Javier's current state of health, the condition of his family, and his location are unknown. The same can be said for his co-workers, Maria and Carlos. As for the plant, they continue to process pork, slaughtering about 19,000 hogs every day. On the morning of September 23, 1839, an experienced sailor named Captain Brighton stood on the deck of his ship, which was traveling through the Drake Passage, which is located right along the northern coast of Antarctica. He and his crew had sailed here because they were professional whalers, and they had heard there was this massive population of whales in the Drake Passage that basically were untouched by humanity because basically nobody sailed this far. This was a freezing cold, very austere part of the world, kind of a dangerous place to be. But so far, Captain Brighton and his crew had not seen a single whale. And on top of that, the Drake Passage had proven to be as dangerous as expected. Just the previous night, the ocean around the ship had literally frozen, basically anchoring the ship in place. And so when this happened, Captain Brighton realized there was nothing they could even do about this. I mean, they were stuck. And if this didn't break up soon, they'd be stuck here all winter potentially, and it was unclear if they could actually survive that. But fortunately, also the previous night, this massive storm rolled in, which, that's dangerous in and of itself. But the severity of this storm was actually a good thing, because it broke up the ice around the ship and allowed Captain Brighton to sail away. And so now, that morning, the ocean was again, liquid, so they were able to move around, but Captain Brighton had a very difficult decision to make. Again, so far they have not caught any whales, and they've invested a lot of time and money to get out here. But, if he stayed out here much longer, he knew they could potentially get stranded again, and he just couldn't let that happen. And so he needed to decide if he was going to keep on sailing further into the Drake Passage to maybe find a couple whales, or leave now before it was too late. But as Captain Brighton weighed his options, he suddenly noticed something over the horizon. There was this dark shape, and at first he actually thought he was hallucinating. Because really, there's nothing else out here. It's just him and ocean and ice. That was it. But as he continued to stare in the direction of this dark object, which was actually getting closer to him, he realized it was a real thing, and in fact, it was another ship, which was really surprising. Because again, nobody really comes out here. And so his instincts were, okay, this has got to be a rival whale ship. I mean, that's the only other people who would come out here. But as he continued to stare at the ship, as it got closer, he realized it was not a whale ship. It was actually a schooner, which is a ship designed for traveling. But as Captain Brighton stared at the schooner that was getting closer and closer, he saw it was in pretty rough shape. I mean, the hull and the sails were very tattered. I mean, there was something off about the ship. But Captain Brighton was thinking, hey, I know you can get trapped in the ice out here. It happened to them the night before. Maybe this crew has gotten trapped in the ice. They've been stuck out here for who knows how long. They could be in pretty rough shape. And Captain Brighton knew they actually did have, at least at that moment, quite a bit of supplies, at least some to spare. And so he called out to his men to ready a dinghy and get some supplies because they were going to go over to this schooner and basically offer up some extra supplies and also check in on them and make sure they were okay. And so once the supplies were packaged up and put on the dinghy, Captain Brighton, along with 4 other men, hopped in the dinghy and they began paddling over to the schooner. And as they got closer, the waves were pretty bad. And so they're kind of jostling around and, the ship itself, the schooner is also moving. And so that's moving up and down. But, periodically as they got closer, they'd be able to look into the portholes, which are like windows on the side of the schooner. And Captain Brighton could clearly see there were people inside of the schooner. He called out a few times, but it was windy and sort of loud, and he couldn't really tell if any of them heard him or if anybody called back. And so eventually, Captain Brighton and his crew, they got to the side of the schooner and they just climbed up the ladder and boarded the ship. And once they were on the ship, once they were on the deck of the schooner, they're looking around and everything was in working order, albeit sort of tattered and in rough shape. But the weird thing is nobody was out on deck. They had seen people in the portholes, which was inside the ship, but there was nobody above deck. And so Captain Brighton's thinking, okay, this is pretty weird here, but we clearly just need to go inside and talk to someone. And so Captain Brighton and his men walked across the deck to this door that led into the ship. It actually led into the captain's quarters, at least, based on basic ship construction, that's what they expected it to be. And so Captain Brighton, he gets to the door, he knocks and calls out, announces that they're here with supplies and just to make sure everybody is okay, but there's no answer. All they can hear is the slapping of the water against the ship. There's no voices, there's nothing. It's silent on the ship. And so Captain Brighton eventually just opens up this door, and sure enough, he looks into this dark space, and it's the captain's quarters. And there's a desk towards the back of this room, and there's a man sitting at the desk with his back to them. So Captain Brighton, he takes a cautious step into the captain's quarters, and he calls out to this man who clearly appears to be the captain, but the man doesn't say or do anything. He's clearly focused on something at his desk. And so Captain Brighton exchanged a worried glance with his men and then just decided he would walk across the room and go physically interact with this guy and make sure he was okay and see what was going on here. And so slowly, Captain Brighton began walking across the room, and as he did, he called out a few more times to this man who appeared to be the captain, but he didn't get a response. And then finally, he was right behind the man, and he actually looked down and read what the man had been writing. This is what it said. "Trapped by icebergs. Despite all efforts, the fire went out last night. No hope remains." However, as unsettling as that would be to read for anybody in this situation, what was the most unsettling part was actually what was written right above that journal entry. The date, January 17th, 1823, 16 years before. That captain and his entire crew were all dead and had been for 16 years. They got trapped in the ice just like Captain Brighton had, but it didn't break up. They were stranded and they all froze to death. And because it was so cold out in that part of the world, all their bodies were basically preserved in their final moments. And so the captain of the ship, before he died, was making an entry to say what happened. And then down below, when Captain Brighton and his men went to go look, they found people playing cards who had literally frozen to death while playing cards. They found a woman lying in her bed with her dog. That's how they froze to death. They found people in the dining hall and they died right where they were sitting. It was like all these people had been frozen in time for nearly 2 decades, just floating around in Drake's Passage. And basically nobody had found them until Captain Brighton. Our next story is called Rite of Passage. On the evening of January 19th, 2022, a 40-year-old mother named Anna Uskova set up a camera and some lights at the edge of a clearing in the woods in St. Petersburg, Russia. Then she focused the camera on the spot in the clearing where she, her husband, and her children were about to perform a very important religious ceremony. So to set the scene here, it was late at night, so it's dark, it was snowing, it's totally freezing. This is the dead of winter out in the middle of Russia. This is a cold, cold environment. But this is when this ceremony was done. In the dead of winter, all over Russia. This was not just something Anna's family was doing, this is like a Russian thing. On this day, all over the country, people would perform this sort of purification ritual that was designed to revitalize their bodies and souls and help them ward off evil spirits for the new year. Now, typically, Anna and her family would perform this big ceremony in a group setting with their church. But this year, Anna decided she wanted to hold this ceremony privately, with just her family kind of out in the woods by themselves. It would be more intimate, and the kids would feel, a bit more involved than they normally did. And so far, it was going great. They had found the perfect location. It was stunningly beautiful. It really felt like the best place to perform the ceremony, but it was kind of odd that when they got there, there was no other families there. They had this place to themselves, which was just crazy, but they thought, great, this is even better for us. This is going to be the perfect ceremony. So while Anna's husband finished prepping everything they would need, Anna hit record on the camera, and then Anna walked out from behind the camera, and you see her come into frame, and she walks over to her kids. And now her kids are going to be performing this ritual the same way Anna and her husband would be, and it's clear they're pretty nervous. Now, they've done this before, but still, this ritual is not very comfortable. It doesn't feel very good, at least in the moment. And so Anna knew this, and so she knelt down with her kids, and she kind of reassured them that they were brave, they were courageous, they could do this, and she was going to go first. And they could see that, once mom did it, they would know that they could do it too. And so at some point, after kind of giving her kids a pep talk, Anna stood up, she walked over to the area that was designated for this ceremony, and then as the camera's rolling, she stood there, she drew a cross on her chest, then she stepped forward and kind of jumped feet first, and then disappeared. One second passed with no sign of Anna, and that was okay, but then 2 seconds passed and there was still no sign of Anna, and then 3 seconds passed and still no Anna. And at that point, her husband and her kids began to scream. So what Anna and her family didn't understand, or at a minimum just did not fully appreciate, was that when they did this ceremony with their church every year, the church took a lot of effort to make sure the location they chose for the ceremony, that it was totally safe. And on top of that, they often had medical personnel on standby, just in case. But Anna and her family had not done either of those things. The location they chose was no doubt stunningly beautiful, but the reason it was deserted is it was a terrible spot for this ceremony. And then also, they didn't have any medical personnel on standby. The ceremony that Anna and her family were taking part in is known as the Russian Orthodox Epiphany, and it's a type of baptism. Basically, people all over Russia at this time of the year will carve a cross-shaped hole in the ice over a body of water, and then one by one, they'll jump into the water and then emerge again, baptized, purified. And so Anna and her family had done that. They had carved the cross in this frozen body of water. But the reason this spot was a terrible spot to do this ceremony and why it was totally deserted is because they had chosen a raging river. That yes, it's frozen, but underneath, that river is still flowing, and it's a very deep river. And so the second Anna stepped into the water feet first, she got swept away. But they didn't have a way for her to re-emerge. It's all frozen ice. And so the second she went under into the pitch black water, she was gone. And within a couple of seconds, her family is expecting her to come back up again, but of course she didn't. And so they began screaming, and Anna's husband actually leapt into the water, but he actually stopped himself really quickly because he felt that current pulling him. And so he got out, and very quickly, a search was launched for Anna, but there was no hope. They couldn't find her, and in fact, to this day, they still have not recovered her body. The next and final story of today's episode is called Under the Tarp. One morning in April of 1848, a group of men were walking towards the coast of King William Island, which is an island located in the freezing Arctic region of northern Canada. These men were members of the Inuit people, who are indigenous to King William Island, and today they were going hunting. Specifically, they were making their way towards the coastline to see if they could find any seals that they could hunt and kill for food and for clothing. However, even though technically the coastline was right in front of them, they couldn't actually see the water because there was this huge icy hill that obstructed their view. So in order to look down to the water, they would have to crest that hill and then look down. As these hunters got closer to the hill, the youngest of the hunters broke from the group and ran up the hill to basically get an early look over and see if he could spot any animals down below. However, as soon as he crested the hill and scanned the coastline, again, you got a picture, it's snowy, icy outside, it's below 0 degrees. I mean, you're in the Arctic wild here. He's looking down, and at first, all he sees is just white, just snow, ice, but he sees something else. And as he's looking at it, he can't even understand what he's seeing. Like, it doesn't make sense, it's not computing. And so at this point, the young hunter kind of ducked down on this side of the hill, kind of away and out of view of the ocean, and he turned and signaled to the other hunters to get up here and take a look. And so the other hunters, they don't really understand what's happening here, but they can see, there's some urgency coming from this young hunter. And so they run up the hill as well, and all together, all at once, they kind of peer up and over the hill again, and they look down, and for a second, they all just stared in horrified silence. Down below, wandering along the coastline, were not seals or walruses or any other animals that these hunters might have expected to see out here. Instead, they saw people. Specifically, they saw Kalunat, which is their word for white men. But these men were not acting like people. They were lumbering, almost like they weren't in control of their bodies. They had these strange, jerky movements, and they were all just kind of staring straight ahead with these vacant expressions, and their skin, it was like black and blue, and their clothes were tattered, and they were just kind of lumbering along, about 40 of these Kalunat, these white men. Now, for these hunters, they really didn't have much exposure or experience around Kalunat, around white men. All they really knew at the time and in this part of the world is that white men were pretty dangerous to the indigenous people. But they did know there was a group of Kalunat who were staying on a ship that was off the coast of King William Island, and they had been living there for the better part of a year, and it seemed like their ship might have frozen off the coast, and they were just kind of trapped until the warmer months came around and they could sail away. But to this point, the Inuit people really had not seen or interacted with any of those white people. They had just kind of kept to themselves, and that was it. So just to see the Kalunat, the white people, on land, that alone was really shocking. Like, what happened? Why did they leave their ship? Why are they here? But again, the way they were moving and how they looked, it seemed wrong. Like there was something wrong with these people. Like there's more to this story than the Inuit people understand. And it was sort of terrifying. And on top of just the way they were moving, there was something else these Kalunat were doing. In addition to these men just kind of lumbering along the coastline, a few of them were dragging this big sled, and there was a tarp over the sled. Clearly something big or several things were under this tarp, but the Inuit hunters, they couldn't quite tell what it was covered up. And so they're just watching these men in this weird parade along the coastline with the sled, and they really were like, we have to get out of here. And so they ducked their heads below the icy hill to kind of stay out of view of the Kalunat, who to this point it did not seem like they had spotted the hunters. And as the hunters are sort of trying to figure out what they should even do, they hear this awful guttural scream coming from down below where these men are, where these white men are. And instinctively, the hunters, they grab their spears and they poke their head up over the hill, almost thinking maybe they've spotted us, maybe they're gonna attack us. But no, when they looked down below, many of the Kalunat were still just kind of lumbering along, but one of them had stopped, and he was kind of retching around like there was something wrong with him, and he continued to scream out, and then he just crumpled to the ground. But the other white men, it was like they didn't even react to it, except for the men pulling the sled. They pulled the sled right up alongside this man who had just fallen to the ground after screaming, and they just sort of nonchalantly pulled back the tarp, revealing all sorts of bodies on the sled. They picked the guy who had just fallen, and they threw him onto the pile. They covered him back up with the tarp, and then, like nothing had happened, the men kept on pulling the sled, and this totally creepy procession continued down the coast. At this point, the Inuit hunters were genuinely terrified, and without saying anything, they just scrambled back down the hill and ran back to their village. The following day, the Inuit hunters came back to that exact spot, that icy hill that looked down to the ocean below, except this time they had brought along several pounds of seal meat. So the previous day, when these hunters had gone back to their village to tell the others about what they had just seen, oddly enough, the consensus became that, of course the Kalunat are sort of dangerous to us and we should keep our distance. But from what you're describing, it sounds an awful lot like these men, these white men, must just be starving. Like the way they're moving, the fact that men are falling down and dying, and they have this, sled full of dead bodies. They're out here in the Arctic wild. I mean, this is a very unforgiving place. And so the consensus was they're starving to death. That's what you're seeing. That's why they're acting the way they are. And so maybe the move here is you hunters go back to that same spot, try to find these Kalunat and give them some food. Not only to help them, to be good people, good stewards of humanity, but also as sort of like a peace offering, because there was tension between the Inuit people and the Kalunat. And so these hunters had agreed. They had showed up with the intention of, finding these 40 some odd white men, giving them some food, and maybe even offering some help, if they needed it. And so that day, the Inuit hunters, they make it back to their spot, they climb up that icy hill, and they look down towards the ocean below, and there's nobody there. It's just complete isolation. And so the hunters, they go down to the coastline and they see footprints from the day before. They find, the tracks from the sled that have been being dragged, and they just start tracking the footprints of these white men. And for hours, these hunters are just following the footprints along this coastline, in the snow and the ice, and they're looking up ahead. They don't see anybody. And it's like, wow, these guys, they covered a huge amount of ground. Where did they go? And eventually, after hours of this, the hunters come upon this campsite, but it's totally abandoned. It's right on the edge of the water, and based on where the campsite was and sort of how fresh it looked, it seemed pretty obvious that at some point, clearly the Kalunat had been camped out here. But they clearly are not here now. But interestingly, the people that had been here, presumably the white men, they had left behind quite a few of their supplies, like the remains of a fire, and sitting over the fire was this big pot, like a metal pot. And you would think if you're struggling to survive out here that you would definitely want to keep some of your cooking supplies, but no, that was left behind along with several other tools. And so the Inuit hunters, they're looking around thinking, okay, well, maybe they just stepped away and they're going to come back, but they searched the vicinity of the campsite, but nobody was there. The footprints just kind of picked up and continued off into the distance. And so feeling pretty puzzled by this, the Inuit hunters decided to just search the campsite and try to get some clue as to what's going on with these white men. And eventually, after searching through all the different things that had been left behind, they came back to that fire and that pot that had a lid over it that was sitting right there. And one of the hunters walks up to the pot, he grabs the lid, he lifts it off, and when he saw what was inside, he reeled back in horror. Several months later, that same group of Inuit hunters had hiked miles and miles down that same coastline of King William Island until they saw off in the distance, right off the coast, this big wooden ship. And these hunters knew this ship belonged to the Kalunat. And today, their plan was to break into the ship and raid it. Because just recently, these hunters had finally kind of solved the mystery of what happened to those, 40 some odd white men they had seen. Because they came across this mass gravesite, of like 30 plus white men all dead in the snow. And clearly they had starved to death and died from exposure. And so it just sort of seemed like this unfortunate thing that these guys had hiked and hiked and hiked and just kind of fell down and died. But now that the Inuit hunters knew that all these white men were dead, they're like, well, there's a ship sitting right out there that, no one's gonna claim, so why don't we take whatever's inside of it? And so the Inuit hunters walked out onto the ocean, which was completely frozen. So the ship, it's off the coast, but it's basically a pathway of ice right up to the ship. And so the hunters, they walked on this ice all the way out to the ship, and when they got there, unsurprisingly, it was totally vacant. It's silent, it's still, clearly there's nobody in this ship. Now, as the Inuit hunters climbed the side of the ship and got ready to go inside, they all had set their expectations to be like, okay, clearly the men who had inhabited this ship at one point, the white men, the Kalunat, they obviously abandoned the ship and, tried their luck on land unsuccessfully, so clearly something must have happened out here. Like they ran out of food, or there was a leak in the ship, or some sort of chaos ensued here that caused them to abandon their shelter and, head towards the Arctic wilds, right? But once they got on board the ship and looked around, they quickly realized the ship was in pristine condition. I mean, there was no damage to the ship. It was practically brand new, preserved out in the ice here. When they went down below, they discovered there were all these bedrooms with these incredibly comfortable looking beds, and there was bunk beds and hammocks with linens and pillows. There was a library with hundreds of books. There were games. There was all this cutlery and fine china. And just off the kitchen, in their pantry, was this massive food storage room full of food. Canned goods, all still good, that apparently had just been left behind. And so the Inuit hunters, they're thinking like, how is this possible? What caused these white men to abandon their ship, which presumably was perfect, pristine, provided much better shelter, and also they abandoned all their food, like they clearly weren't starving. So what happened? What caused them to go on land and die horrible deaths? Well, the reason for this would not fully make sense for another 130 years, because it was in the 1980s when researchers actually began to analyze the remains of these white men, those 30, 40 white men who were found dead on King William Island. It would turn out those men were explorers who had been sent out to the Arctic by the British government. And they had been well outfitted when they were sent out on their journey. I mean, they were given that incredible ship, and they were given all these supplies, including a whole bunch of canned food items. However, what these explorers didn't know is that their canned food had become tainted with lead. And so as they slowly were eating all these canned food items, they were slowly poisoning themselves. And one of the side effects of lead poisoning, in addition to feeling nauseous and horribly sick, is it drives you crazy. It basically gives you these wild mood swings. And so like the whole ship, all these men are undergoing these totally insane mood swings and basically falling into actual mental hysteria out on this ship. And so in their hysterics, all these men decide to abandon their ship and head into the Arctic wild to forage for food and who knows what. I mean, they literally were out of their minds. And when they got to land into the wilderness, they didn't find food, they didn't find shelter, they found death and misery. And as they devolved into insanity and men began falling down and dying because they were starving to death, they began eating their brothers. They began eating the dead men. That sled they were dragging along was not to preserve the bodies to give them a proper burial down the road. It was like their mobile refrigeration unit. They were dragging those bodies along and then eating them. And so the reason those Inuit hunters were so horrified when they discovered that campsite and they looked inside of that pot, well, it's because inside of the pot was clearly a human skull, and that skull had been cracked open as if whoever was tending this pot had literally been scooping in and basically eating this person's brain. To this day, bones of the crew members of that failed expedition are still being found on King William Island.
The air is clean and slow, leaving its pressure on the mark. We built the lens to steal the light, 1,000,000 years across the void. But the truth revealed by the empty night is nothing we can feel or avoid. 0.6 parsecs away, a number that cannot be held. Just stay together, day by day, in the silence that the cold stars yield. The scope is fixed, the mirror waits. What's inside is harder to define. The mind expands, the heart dilates on the edge of the infinite design. Break the glass of the
A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The Mr. Ballin podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, Mr. Ballin. Our head of writing is Evan Allen, produced by Jeremy Bone. This episode was written by Kate Gallagher. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, and Camille Callahan. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio and Cole Lacasio. Additional audio editing by Jordan Stidham. Production coordination by Samantha Collins. Production support by Antonio Minata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song called Something Wicked by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballin podcast. And just a reminder, every new and exclusive episode we put out on the Mr. Ballin podcast, you can also now watch on the Mr. Ballin YouTube channel that very same day. And trust me, some of these stories you truly have to see to believe. Again, my YouTube channel is just called Mr. Ballin. If you want to listen to episodes 1 week early and ad-free,